Thank you everybody for coming to the first of this semester's seminar talks. I have somewhat optimistically titled mine, "At least it's not boring," and I hope indeed it's not boring. As you'll see, I'm sort of referencing something that sort of was said once about my research, and so I've always tried to take that as my personal motto. But yeah, before I begin, I would like to just start with an acknowledgement of country, acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of...
You've just got on mute, Andy.
Andy, you're on mute.
Sorry, I think that might have been me.
It's a CHDH. Simon's taking over.
Yeah, all right, totally. All right, let me try that again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Let's try this one more time. That's okay. And you see the whole screen and everything? Okay. All right, so thank you everyone for coming to this first seminar of the second semester in our seminar series, where people talk about their life, both personal and intellectual. I'll be giving the one today, and I've somewhat optimistically titled my talk, "At least it's not boring." As you'll see, this references something that happened to me once, but hopefully it's true of my talk as well. But before I begin, I wanted to begin by just acknowledging country, acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the custodians of the land where the University of Melbourne is, also where I'm recording this from, which is up in the Dandenongs. I have no idea where everyone else is, but I acknowledge all the lands from whoever may be coming in. And I'd like to pay respect to the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and extend this respect to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait people who might be with us today. So when I was trying to think about how to structure this talk, being the total nerd I am, I kind of, I've been thinking for a while as sort of life and science in terms of the metaphor of searching a complicated high dimensional search space, much as we try to do in our computer algorithms. But of course, life and science are much harder than any of the spaces we try to search with our algorithms, because we don't even know what the dimensions are or what we're searching for. And you can see here some of the possible dimensions that a life might search over: race, class, interest, gender, location. And thinking about my life, I've realized it's actually been a search over many of these dimensions myself. And really what people in the literature think of probably as a high dimensional search. So you can either do little local steps, which means you're very thoroughly searching one small area, or you can do high temperature jumps, like just, you know, careening madly about, which gives you a much broader gist of the space, but not sort of local texture. And I think my life has been much, and my temperament is much more like these high dimensional search. So that's kind of the metaphor to see it through. Where I started from is actually quite far away, I think, both physically and in most dimensions. I grew up in rural New Mexico. So by rural, I mean really rural. Where I lived is called a census designated place. It's not even a village or a town. There were too few people for that. Near Santa Fe, New Mexico. And New Mexico is a bit of an odd place for America, in that it's actually the oldest capital in the country. It was settled by the Spanish much earlier. It has a very, very strong Spanish and minority presence. It's actually the only, when I was growing up at least, the only majority minority state. So lots of Spanish spoken. And the population of where I grew up, it was a few hundred. One day we literally went around and counted ourselves because we knew everybody in their houses. And these are pictures of the house where I grew up. As you can see, very rural, very dry, although in the winters, you know, at least back then, we got some nice snowstorms, and really, really isolated. And my family was quite large. My mom is a good Catholic. I'm the second oldest of 5. You can see me here in the upper corner. I'm the oldest daughter. My parents were both math teachers. My mom, well, that is until my mom had to quit to take care of 5 kids. Again, that says something about the times. And as a kid, probably surprising nobody to hear that I was quite a nerd. I read all the time. I started reading early, and that was pretty much the thing I did. I was also super into math and everything. And being so isolated and being actually quite a weird kid in many ways, I really didn't have that many close friends, but my siblings and I were friends. Especially me and my older brother. So basically, until we were teenagers, like, I essentially, wanted to be him. And here's a picture of us just playing in the dirt, which is what we did a lot. This is me pretending I was an old man, which I did a lot. I liked imagining myself with a beard and a mustache. I actually wanted to be a football player when I grew up, and also a physicist at the same time who went to other planets. As you'll see, that actually many of these dreams have sort of, not been that far off of what I actually did. And we didn't have much money at all. As you imagine, a teacher's salary, 5 kids in the middle of nowhere. But it was a really loving family. And I look back on my early childhood with a lot of joy. But then when I was 10, we moved to Colorado, which wouldn't seem that different, like it was pretty close, but it was quite a culture shock for me because we moved from this, essentially very, very isolated place to a small town, which seemed to me huge, but it was very conservative, very white, very religious, and seemed to me enormous. And the culture shock, it was pretty great. It was really beautiful. I have a lifelong love of, I think, rural areas. We actually live not far from the deepest canyon in the US. And so I got quite spoiled that way. But it was really, I was not that happy as an adolescent. I didn't fit in almost every way there was possible to fit. That's me. Giving the valedictory speech at when I graduated. So I did get out, but for much of my adolescence, I had no idea how I could get out or how I could make my life what I wanted it to be. I was beginning to realize that my sexuality and my gender were all wrong. I actually didn't consciously realize about gender, but I realized about sexuality. I was interested in women mainly. This is a very rural area that went for Trump and was even more conservative when I grew up. A big thing I remember is there's this amendment called Amendment 2 when I was about 14, which was basically all set up to sort of say it was a very anti-gay amendment, basically. And I remember this coming around and everyone arguing about how terrible gays were and everything, and realizing, ugh, that's kind of me, maybe. And it was sort of really alienating and hard. The same time, I was realizing I was not religious, and my family was quite religious. My community was quite religious, and had basically one of the larger confrontations of my teenage years with my mom over refusing to get confirmed because I refused to stand up and say I believed in God when I didn't. And so that was difficult. And then the main thing was just school was really, really terrible. I was really bored. I spent most of the time sitting in back reading, and luckily it was easy. So I got really good grades, so no one bothered me, but I was completely unengaged, and basically kept good grades because I thought that was my ticket out, and otherwise I wouldn't even have done that. But it was just really kind of soul destroying in some ways. And so what I tried to do is just fill my time as much as I could with other stuff. So I worked part-time, about 20 hours a week, at Dairy Queen, selling ice cream. That was kind of fun. I also did graphic design for a local real estate company. I really want to be a physicist, I think still, mainly because I really like the idea of using math and applying it to describe the world. But I didn't know how. I mean, most people in my community worked at the local chocolate factory. I had no idea if this was realistic or not. I didn't know how it could possibly pay for university. It just seemed like a pipe dream. But I also discovered computer programming. So that picture there, that's my family's first computer. And my dad was a math teacher, also a computer teacher, and he brought home games. I learned how to program by stopping the games in the middle, and then you could look at the code and sort of reverse engineer the code. So I really got into programming and a debate team. And so those kind of kept me in. And then basically I applied to a bunch of colleges having no idea what I was doing. But luckily, Stanford actually accepted me, and more than that, because they're a fairly rich institution, they actually paid most of my way, which meant it was affordable in a way that the others weren't. So I headed off to Stanford having no idea what I was getting into. And talk about culture shock. It was more of culture shock than, it was so rich, so wealthy. And, you know, it was like another world intellectually as well. And it was really, really, really cool. I still didn't fit in those ways. Like I was sort of, you know, this poor weirdo is what I felt like. But it was so exciting to fit in sort of the intellectual ways. I made friends, good friends for the first time in my life. I did things. That's me jumping out of an airplane. I joined rugby, which is not football, is actually even better than football. Sorry for many American football purists here. And basically I love rugby. That's me all dirty after a practice. The Stanford team, we ended up winning the national championships and going on tour in Fiji and New Zealand. And that was one of the first times I'd been overseas. And it was just incredible. And it really blew my mind and it opened up the world intellectually too. So I basically tried everything I could. I ended up not majoring in physics because I started majoring in physics. And I didn't do that well, at least not for me. I was used to sort of acing everything. And suddenly I was against really smart people who had way better background than I did. And that was kind of demoralizing. But more importantly, I realized what I was more in love with the idea of physics than actually doing it, where, you know, a lot of the easy pickings of physics had already been figured out. And, you know, a lot of what they had to do was work in large teams on abstract things about string theory or whatever. That appealed less. But I discovered this thing called symbolic systems, which is basically cognitive science. And that appealed to me because, you know, it meant that I didn't have to decide what I wanted to do, essentially. It had psychology, cognitive science, linguistics, philosophy, and computer science all in one. And so that was kind of a perfect major for me. There is the office where I actually, my senior year, worked as one of the advisors there. And that was, so I have fond memories of that little advisor. And I also basically took advantage of a lot of opportunities that in hindsight basically occurred because I needed summer housing. So I was really desperate to stay there for the summers, but of course I had no money. And so, you know, like one summer I actually, that picture at the top is where I stayed that summer, was on the roof of a co-op. And so they sold, you know, you could buy a space on the roof for like $20 a week or something. And that was the affordable thing. So one summer I did that. And basically my desperation for housing meant that I basically took whatever opportunities I could. I worked in the cafeteria. That didn't give me housing, but that got me food. And I ended up teaching at a computer camp several summers. Again, largely I was interested in teaching, but mainly it was for the housing. And I discovered there that I love teaching. And I really loved, we taught kids to program in BASIC at the time. And I really, really realized that I love teaching. And so it was great because it got me housing, but also it sort of showed me, yeah, if I could do teaching somehow in my life, that would be awesome. And the other thing that university offered was basically my first research experience, which also came because I needed housing. So I did this program called Sophomore College in the summer, mainly because I wanted housing. But as part of that, I started working with Anne Fernald, who does research in infancy and infant language learning. And from there, she invited me to join her lab, and I worked in her lab for 3 years. Here's me sort of coding the infants, very old school. I got to go to my first conference. Really, Anne made a huge impact on me and my later research. And what my honors thesis ended up being about was about infant language processing. So basically what we did is we take infants, have them come in and look at two pictures like this, you know, while hearing some sentence like, where's the doggy? And then you look at what the infants are looking at and measure their speed. And basically the speed that they turn to look at the correct picture is a sign of their linguistic processing. So what we did is we followed these infants over several years. So this was an honors project, but I started it my sophomore year. And then what we found is essentially that their vocabulary size early, like vocabulary size, even at 15 or 18 months, predicted how fast they'd be processing things at 25 months. And I think it was one of the first studies to show this kind of deep relationship. It was, like I said, it was super cool and really impactful, and it made me really realize I want to continue doing research too. But I was feeling very, very split, because on the one hand, I was pretty sure I did want to go into academia, but I still had this sort of, you know, real strong pressure from how I'd grown up and how I'd seen like most of my siblings, my cousins, and my hometown. There's really quite a notion of home and family, and, you know, this feeling that by going into academia, I was becoming one of these liberal elite people, you know, and most of that I'd managed to sort of get rid of, but, you know, there was still, I've always wanted a family, and I kind of felt like this was the only recognized way I knew how to have a family. It would be safe and secure, it'd be stifling, but on the other hand, it did have a big pull. And on the other hand, I saw there was this life of the mind, you know, this kind of intellectual and, you know, really a life that suited me more in terms of, you know, who I was. I could be out. But it also felt selfish. People told me it was selfish and lonely, and also felt risky because I didn't know many people who'd gone into academia or really done much outside of my hometown, and I didn't know how to square those things. So when I graduated, what I did is I went back home for the summer, and so hung out with my family again, and that was very cool. And I took a job, I just took some random jobs. So this is me as a manual laborer. My brother got me this job because they wouldn't have hired a girl anyways, otherwise. But basically, it was making what's called an earth ship, which is basically an eco-friendly house made out of tires. You spent the whole day sledgehammering dirt into tires. I got incredibly fit very fast, and it was really fun. That didn't last the whole summer, so I also worked at a mine teaching tourists how to gold pan. It was mainly not a working mine, but it was really beautiful. And then I also went with my best friend to Europe. So basically I just tried to sort of, you know, a lot at home, reminding myself of what I liked about that, but then also remembering, you know, what I liked about Stanford and that sort of thing, and came to some conclusions. The first was that I'd take this extra year to get a master's, mainly because it was fairly easy. So Stanford offered a co-terminal program, which meant that basically I didn't have to pay extra for it, and I could pay for what I had to by tutoring. And I wanted to get a different kind of research. So I knew that I loved research, but infants, basically I wanted something that was, you know, made use of my computer science and that sort of background, and was a little more theoretical. So I worked with David Beaver, who's a semanticist. My project was basically, I was really interested in language evolution at the time, or language evolution, and at the time it was really, really hard to know how to study. So in the past, say 10 or 15, 20 years, they've made great strides in knowing how to take, you know, do computational simulations of evolution and that stuff. The time I did this, none of that, almost none of that existed. And so I wanted to try to figure out how I could use models to explore some of these questions in evolution. And my question was basically how from nothing you could even get the idea of reference. So what I did is I tried to evolve agents using something called genetic programming, where basically the agents are programs themselves, and you recombine parts of programs to get different ones. I named my agents Ernie and Bert. They talked to each other. They had some fitness based on successful communication. It was really, really interesting. what I came to the end of was realizing that it was basically too ill-formed to basically analyze easily. I never ended up publishing it for that reason. It was fine for a master's thesis, and it taught me a lot about basically the problems with doing something too new and unfocused. You know, we want to stretch, but we don't want to stretch so much that it's unclear what we can find out. But anyways, that was very, very informative. The other thing, though, after this, and this was sort of because of the realization I made this summer, is that I decided that I wanted to do, before going on into academia, if I was going to go on into academia, I wanted to do something else very, very, very different. So what I did is I joined the Peace Corps, which is an American program where they send you to go work in a developing country, live in the villages with the people, and you know, it's very much not top down the way many NGOs work. It's supposed to be a cultural exchange as much as anything. And so they sent me to Mozambique, which at the time that I went there was just emerging from a civil war. It was very, very poor. It's still poor, but I think then it was much poorer. So they speak Portuguese there. And HIV and AIDS were starting to be a big problem coming up from South Africa. This is just a few pictures of the area where I lived. So most people lived in these little huts made of tin or mud. Everyone got around on these trucks, which were called chapas. And what my job was is I was a teacher, surprise. I taught high school. Actually, I mostly taught biology, which ended up being a lot of health stuff, but I also taught English because they needed that. The school was one where basically this lower middle picture shows the school. What it doesn't show is that inside the classrooms, there's no chairs at all. So it's basically just flat floor. I had, I think, 8 or 9 classrooms of 50 students each throughout the day. So it was intense. The students had no chairs, nothing. All they had was a notebook. That was the limit of my supplies. I had a chalkboard. Many of the times, if we didn't have the classroom, we taught under the tree. And I lived in this little tiny hut, which is the little cement thing on the left, which is actually one of the better housing in the area because it was cement. It was intense. I mean, in many ways, it was amazing. So this picture is me with my homeroom class. The kids and people were really, really impressive. And I was constantly kept thinking, man, there's so much human talent here wasted. People with so many skills and abilities that ended up, you know, essentially having to be subsistence farmers their whole life. My best friend there was this guy named Gilles. That's the top picture. He was the town carpenter. Again, a brilliant, brilliant guy. In another life, I don't know what he might have made of himself, but he was a great guy. But it was really isolating and really, really difficult, and I got very depressed. Again, basically, I didn't fit at all in ways that were more profound than anything else. So obviously the gender role thing was terrible for me. There I am having to wear dresses all the time. They didn't even think girls and guys could really talk to each other that much. It was incredibly alienating. In hindsight, also the medication, the malaria medication they had me on was really bad for my head. I had, you know, a lot of dissociative episodes, very bored. Basically, I became the insane person in my hut. So I just spent more and more time in my hut writing treatises about this or that. Really, you know, I wrote a novel. And essentially, I realized it got bad enough that one day I ended up just breaking and sort of taking one of those chapas inland, which is very dangerous because there were mines everywhere. And my thought was really unfocused. It was just, I have to get out of here. I went inland and I got like half an hour and then I was like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done, and came back. But I was like, I am not really trustworthy. I'm too depressed. And so I left early after a year and really felt like I was a total failure because I couldn't do this. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was, you know, incredibly depressed. I didn't, you know, yeah. But I did realize that, you know, I couldn't spend my life trying to be someone else. Like part of why I'd done Peace Corps is I wanted to give back and I wanted to do real world more than academia. And I realized that it was a net negative for everyone involved. Like I wasn't very good at it. I was taking the place of someone who was made to sit and have conversations about chickens and you know, be in touch with people that way. And those were not my strengths. You know, I can't play a lot of the roles, especially not the girl roles, but I couldn't even play the guy roles very well. And if I'm to make an impact, if I want to make an impact, it has to be by doing the things that I am good at and not trying to make myself someone else. And so that's kind of what I realized there. I had no idea how to do that. So I went back home. First, I just spent a few months sitting in my parents' basement. Thank goodness for them. They let me do that without questioning too much. Then I went back to California, and I also spent the summer at the Santa Fe Institute, you know, trying to get back and remind myself what I loved, which had a lot to do with, you know, intellect and science. And Santa Fe Institute is all about complex systems, the math of them. And it was really tying, you know, together some of my interests in cognition and emergence and that sort of thing. And that was one of the best things I've ever done for myself. So at the Santa Fe Institute, mainly as the people there, I met my future partner, that's Toby. He's the guy on the lower right. I had only ever been interested in women, so it took me a little while to realize. And so we were friends for a while before dating. At the time at the Santa Fe, we were friends. But I met a lot of other people. Some of you may recognize one guy there, Nick Geard, who is, you know, I think down on he's in CIS down on the 7th floor. We got to be friends there, and you know, had a lot of fun and did a lot of cool stuff. We did a final project called Look, a Power Law, which is all about the mathematics of power laws. Didn't publish anything, but it was so fun, and it really, really helped me bring myself back together again. And then I had some time before I could apply to grad school, so I was a head tutor at Stanford, again, working with Anne and Russ Fernald. I also applied to a bunch of grad schools. These are the 5 I applied to. My thought, they're all really pretty hard to get into, but my thought was that if I couldn't work with them, then it probably wasn't worth myself going through the rigors of grad school. And all of them basically were interested in, you know, some element of computer science, cognitive science, and language. And I ended up working with Josh Tenenbaum, but just sort of the process of applying there and talking to everyone was pretty amazing. And I also just did things like, you know, remind myself, you know, I have friends, play rugby. I went to Peru for 6 weeks with a bunch of friends. That was really cool. And then I went to MIT. And that was fantastic intellectually. So here's just a bunch of my friends that you know, you may recognize Charles in there and several other people. Lauren Schmidt was my best friend. Was also really, really hard at times. So I had some major league imposter syndrome because people there are so smart. That was the first time I finally got diagnosed with ADD and realized that some of my dissociation and boredom was probably due to that. And I probably could have only gotten diagnosed at MIT because they were good at recognizing that someone can be apparently high achieving while still having it. And you know, before then, I think no one would have believed it. I also started dating Toby and was maintaining a long distance relationship at the time, which was hard. So, you know, there were good things, but they were pretty difficult years. And at first I spent a while flailing around. So the American PhD lasts longer than the Australian PhD, which is good, I think. But it does mean that you tend to, there's more expectation that the student finds their own topic. And so the first year I spent a while I had so many things, I didn't know how to put them together, and I spent a long time paralyzed. And I ended up going down some random tangents. So one of the tangents is I did this study for a class about sound symbolism, and, you know, basically put pictures, different people on hot or not with different names to see if the names affected how hot they were. This was a class that I did this for, but then the results came out kind of interesting. So I submitted to a conference mainly so that I could go to the conference. You know, it was a mildly interesting result. There were like tens of thousands of data points, which in hindsight is probably why I got any result at all. A tiny effect on a scale, but, you know, submitted this to this conference. And then what totally surprised me is like someone found this in the abstract of the conference and it spread all over the place. So Nature found this, they wrote about it, and then BBC, New Scientist, you know, it spread all over the place. I got, I was on some radio show in Perth, the Irish Examiner. Like if you Google things, you'll find all sorts of really terrible articles about this thing. And in one way, this was very cool. Oh yeah, and this is sort of, I want to show the,
hey, but what about that Ivy League?
all right, sorry, hang on a second. It actually, and there was actually a TV show or a radio segment or a TV segment, a news segment done about me. I'm not gonna play the whole segment, but this is how it ended.
Hey, but what about that Ivy League study?
You'd think they'd have better things to do at MIT.
At least it's not boring. David Robichaud, Nightcast at 10.
So that was how it ended. The whole thing was about as, you know, soul destroying as that. You'd think they'd have better things to do. And so in one way it was really cool, like just, you know, first year grad student, people are talking about my work, but mostly it was really stressful because this is not the work that I wanted people to be talking about. It really stressed me out that lots of famous people in the field, this is the first they heard of me rather than doing something, you know, more important. And it also really showed me how quickly news can spread and get warped by the framing of it. So yeah, I survived that. And eventually after enough flailing, things began to cohere in my PhD. So Josh Tenenbaum, my advisor, he works on Bayesian models. And I realized in sort of, you know, learning more and more about them that they're a really great way to address these long-standing questions in linguistics, which tend to be about learnability, what's possible to learn. And I think this is one of the great things that models are work for, because you can just say what information is in there, what assumptions you have to build into the learner, and, you know, and then what can be learned. So my thesis addressed several classic learning problems. One of them was based on this thing called Gold's theorem, which essentially says that if you're a learner, you only receive positive evidence, that is, you don't know what's ungrammatical, then it's actually logically impossible to learn a language that's not finite, because no matter how many instances you get, you might think that a certain thing is possible when it's not. And so the sort of probabilistic argument against Gold's theorem is to say, well, yeah, you might not be able to know with 100% certainty, but if you pay attention to what doesn't show up when you expect it to, then the more and more something doesn't show up, the less likely it is to be acceptable. And so what I did in my thesis is I took this over-hypothesis model that Charles, mainly Charles, and I developed for a different sort of thing about word learning bias, and applied it to studying verbs and verb argument constructions, which is where this classic learning problem had been situated a lot, and essentially showed that it could account for some of the generalization patterns people show in these. So that was part of it. Another classic learning problem came from Chomsky, who really sort of had argued quite strongly that children must be born with the innate knowledge that language has hierarchical phrase structure, that is, phrases embedded in phrases. And so I asked, is that actually the case? And so I gave a Bayesian model that had the ability to represent phrase structure, but also other kinds of grammatical structure, gave it typical child-directed inputs, and then this model essentially tried to trade it off how well it could fit the input with sort of simplicity. And I showed that essentially this model, without a previous bias towards preferring hierarchical phrase structure, would end up preferring hierarchical phrase structure. So that was also really cool. Chomsky didn't particularly like the paper, and it was again the focus of quite a bit of attention, which was much nicer attention than the hot or not attention, in that it was about something that I believed in and liked, but it was also quite a negative, because I realized, like, I'd stumbled into a very dogmatic kind of area with lots and lots of history and personalities and tempers, and I didn't really much like that. Like, it felt like I was wading into a battlefield, and I didn't really sort of see science as that. So there's me defending my PhD. I'd realized over the course of it that I really liked the core duties of academic, but I really didn't like the really bad work-life balance you get at MIT. I did not like the uncertainty and precarity of academia, never knowing what you're going to do. I did not like that dogmatic debate type thing. You know, I like thinking we're all a team trying to learn things rather than, you know, people yelling at each other about stuff. And I was really, really over, this whole time I'd had a long distance relationship, still wanted a family. So what I decided is to go on the job market early, after only 5 years, only apply for a few places in Australia or Canada because Toby's from England and didn't want to live in America and I didn't want to live in England. So we thought Australia and Canada, only tenure track positions. And I thought if it doesn't work out, then I've got several years after that. I actually heard about the position I ended up taking from Simon Dennis, who I met at a conference and he mentioned it. And so long story short, I basically got hired at the University of Adelaide and I went to Adelaide. I'd never been there before in my life. It is a lovely, lovely little city with some really great colleagues. I grew a lab there. I made some friends, bought a house. I got cats. Really started getting involved in the Oz Math Psych community, which is, you know, in many ways an ideal academic community, super friendly, rigorous, but not dogmatic. And that made my science a whole lot better. I also had 2 kids during this time. So these are my 2 kids. And that was, you know, I wanted kids ever since I was young. That was really wonderful, but it was also really, really exhausting and really, really hard. And in some ways, I think even for everything else, this was the hardest time of my life. Pregnancy was essentially a nightmare of body horror, dysphoria for me. I vomited throughout all of them. Like I had really, really bad, I was, you know, they put me on the cancer chemotherapy anti-nausea drugs because it was so bad. When the babies were born, my kids are wonderful now, but they were insane babies. So like these top pictures, that one on of the sitting baby, that's my son. He's 3 months old sitting. The other one is my other son. He's 2.5 months old standing. I mean, they were nuts. They didn't want to sit and relax ever, constantly alert. I got very little sleep. And essentially I just kept going through willpower and dissociation. You know, it was so hard. And, you know, while this was all going on, I was basically teaching, started a computational cognitive science course with Danny Navarro, set up a lab. And I really enjoyed all those things, but, you know, and had some fantastic students and really enjoyed mentoring too, but also realized like these responsibilities pen me in. Like I could not afford to drop balls, where once in my life I could just leave if something got hard. I didn't feel like I could, and that kind of made it even harder. That said, basically what I always do when things got hard is I just sort of work, kept me grounded. I was really building on my PhD, really interested in how different kinds of data license different generalizations and assumptions about them. And so that was sort of the strand that I went through. I didn't want to talk about language anymore because that sort of experience with Chomsky had sort of poisoned it a bit. And also Adelaide didn't have many language people. So it ended up getting a bit more abstract and cog-sci. I ended up sort of investigating this different kinds of evidence, and we sort of showed that positive evidence for a lot of assumptions is actually might be a lot more useful than negative evidence, which I think speaks to a lot of the debates about confirmation bias and that sort of thing, and actually showed mathematically that, you know, that if good theories, or, you know, in the sense of coherent theories, tend to be the exact kind for which positive evidence is powerful. And then we showed experimentally people are sensitive to this. And then from there, basically, really started getting into this interesting question of how data generalization more broadly licenses different kinds of inference. So I'm going to resist the temptation to go into many details about this, but one of the essential insights is that if data is generated from the thing being taught, either intentionally by a helpful person or just sampled from that context, that concept. It's called strong sampling. Then you can account for a lot of types of reasoning that otherwise look inexplicable. So in this work with Keith Ransom and others, we basically showed that different patterns of category-based induction are explainable if you assume that people think that you're providing examples of an argument in order to be informative. In this work with Andrew Hendrickson, we showed that you can actually explain differences in between one category and two category generalization if you assume that people think that the data is generated in different ways for the two things. I showed that people, when they're learning a new language, a sort of regularity, that they will basically behave differently if they think that their input sort of, if deviations from the norm represent mistakes versus represent sort of an actual pattern to be learned. And you can also explain things like how kids will reason differently based on if they think the person providing the information knows what they're talking about or not. And as part of that, I ended up sort of thinking quite a lot about the place of models, especially Bayesian ones, in cognitive science, because I was doing a lot of models and experimental work. And I ended up arguing, like, a lot of what people end up really thinking about with Bayesian models is, to what extent have you built in what you're trying to conclude? And so I wrote a paper that I'm still quite fond of, where I basically made this distinction between sort of what's explicitly versus latently built in, and argued that in everything you essentially have to latently build in. The real question is this sort of explicit building in. And I also argued that Bayesian models should be used much more interestingly than they often are, which is, instead of saying people are optimal, if they have this likelihood in prior, it's still also a framework to learn what people's priors and likelihoods are. And I have lots of other thoughts about sort of, when modeling is useful and when it isn't. And sort of as part of that, I guess I also started thinking about, this is all individual level, but I was really thinking about, of course, individuals are part of a system, and thinking about how individuals contribute to the information system itself. So I did some stuff in language evolution, showing that lexical systems are shaped by what you have to learn, and also sort of simulation work showing that systems of learners, basically different kinds of heterogeneous ones, can have different effects, disproportionate effects on what gets passed around. Also a bunch of other stuff which I'm going to gloss over because I'm conscious of time. But basically, this just shows I can't just do one thing. I do lots of high temperature bounces, and that's true of my research as well. And then around 2016, I hit another transition point, partly because of looking at what's going on in the world, Trump and Brexit, and seeing about my kids. Partly because at MathPsych in Adelaide, Danny left, John left. I was starting to feel even very intellectually isolated, and realizing I wanted a community that's more than just a few people, something robust, and really wanting to be in a place to make more of a difference than I felt I could make at Adelaide. So I tried to go elsewhere. Luckily, Melbourne was there for me. So in 2017, I moved here. I have to say it's been a really great fit, sort of intellectually and as well not. So we got a house in the Dandenongs, the kids are thriving. I was able to sort of, be part of this Center for Excellence bid on computational behavioral science, part of the hub. We ran the summer school when there wasn't COVID going on. Lots of great people. I could probably put more people there, but, ran out of space. But it's really, really been fantastic. And intellectually, I'm still sort of building on these previous things, but I find myself more and more moving towards wanting to understand basically the systemic and the social elements of inference and learning. So I'm doing a lot of stuff with experiments and simulations, trying to understand polarization, information transmission, misinformation, stuff with DST and many others. And also understanding how our social assumptions and goals shape what we learn. So, what information do we share with others? We have this, little fake Twitter world paradigm where we manipulate different kinds of things. And those are, again, my primary things, but I've got lots of secondary things, which I don't have time to go into. So it's been really great intellectually being here. That said, and I think this is sort of, they say, you have your midlife crisis when you finally have time to sort of think about things. And so I had my midlife crisis a couple of years ago. Essentially all this stuff that I've been talking about, and my go-to solution of dissociating away, it stopped working for various reasons. I had a very, very, very hard year. Ended up having to take off for mental health reasons, which probably ended up saving me in many ways. And my family and friends helped a lot. And part of that was basically admitting to myself that I'm transgender. Most of you have probably read this post I made. There's a whole lot of personal stuff wrapped up into this, but a lot of it was basically finally having to take seriously things that I just barreled through and tried to ignore most of my life. And that was a very hard year. But it seems weird to say, but, especially with coronavirus and lots of terribly shitty stuff happening nowadays, I'm a lot more optimistic nowadays than I've been in a while. So things are looking up, even with coronavirus. I'm me, and that makes a big difference. But I also realized, I'm in a great place with some really great people. My kids are amazing. I discovered the joy of teaching Bunnyland. So I'm teaching the stats course subject now, which really is just the most fun thing teaching I've ever done. And, putting in another Center of Excellence bid. Next year, I'm helping organize CogSci, and our theme is cognitive diversity. And so it's realizing I'm finally in a place in my career where I actually can make a difference in a way that's authentic to me. And so it's really, really good and hopeful, even while spending all this time in lockdown, slowly dying because of that. So I guess I don't have a real good wrap up because, my life is not over and I'm still essentially doing the same thing I've done. I'm still bouncing around. I don't expect that will end. Me, 5-year-old me would have probably been astonished at almost every aspect of my life now, but I think happy astonished. I think that I'm in a super good place, but I think part of how I got there is by continuing to be open to experience and basically be the best me I can be. So I guess I'll stop there and take questions. I'm sorry I ended up glossing so much over the research part of things, but I found I couldn't tell that story as much without the personal bits. So yeah, any questions? I can't actually see the chat. So Simon, do you want to pull out pictures of the chat or your questions from the chat? Yeah, Simon, how do you want to work questions?
Yeah, that's okay. I'm just looking now. People should feel free to just unmute and ask questions too.
Yeah. Oh, one thing, looking at the chat real fast. Yes, there will be a recording, and I'll let everyone know how to access it. Yeah. And if you're not on the chat, feel free to just unmute yourself and ask things.
Just Andy, it looks like someone might have some trouble finding questions because there's just so much love in the chat. So
Right. Okay, so
people just really loved your talk.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Andy, I just wanted to say that you're the best teacher I've had in my entire school life, and I'm quite old.
Thank you.
I'm a mature age student, so I've been to school for a lot of years. I think you're the best teacher I've ever had. Seriously.
So Andy, you have a question from Charles. Did you see that in the chat?
No, I didn't. Charles, do you want to unmute yourself and ask? That way everyone can hear. Yeah.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for the talk. I just wanted to ask about the connection between the personal part and the research part of your talk. I'd be interested to hear if you have thoughts about like how your personal history shapes your approach to research and what you choose to work on.
That's a really good question. Well, I guess there's the sort of connection I've made explicit, which is that my style and temperament is similar in my life and research, which is I hop about, from thing to thing, and have a really hard time sort of doing just one thing or staying in one place. But I think there's a deeper link, which is that I started off really wanting to, understand people in a nice abstract mathematical way, sort of not as part of the system they're in or as part of other people. And as I'm getting, I'm realizing more and more that we humans can't be understood in isolation. We're embedded among each other. Even the things we have to learn are shaped by everyone else. And this is true for research. So almost all my research questions now are about that interaction, but it's also, I think, just seeing the way the world is going as well. Like, I realize most of this situation, most of the problems of the world come from that interaction, come from us having to figure out how to live with each other and learn from each other. And so I feel like it's not just an intellectual question, it's a deep human question of how do we be ourselves while also living with each other. And that's kind of been, I guess, my thing too, like, how do I be me and authentically me while also living in a world and giving people what they need to, not letting down my family, my students, and so forth. I don't know if that answers, but yeah.
And just a logistical question: do you still need the slides? Because I think it might be easier to basically talk to everyone face to face.
Yeah.
If you weren't planning on using slides.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
All good.
There we are. Yeah. And actually, I can see everyone. So yeah. Any other questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and ask, I think.
I really enjoyed the social historical aspects of an excellent story here, especially like your move to Stanford and this very different milieu you found there in the 1990s. I'd be interested to hear more about, especially in terms of issues to do with gender and identity and women's roles and stuff like this. How did you find things there in Stanford?
Yeah, no, that was really, I mean, it's quite interesting because, so as a contrast to where I grew up, I mean, it was just incredibly liberal and open in terms of sort of gender and, what women could do and so forth. Where I grew up was very much like, I literally had one of my high school teachers tell me that my duty was to be a helpmeet to my future husband. And, like, this was not seen as all unusual. And so Stanford was this tremendous contrast to that. But now, of course, 20 years later, looking back to it, it does look, especially as regards to like transgender issues and stuff, it's very much a product, but even gender issues, like, we've made a lot of progress as society, in 20 years there. I'd heard about transgender stuff then. In fact, I even helped teach a unit in human biology on that, but I didn't see that as relevant to me because it's so pathologized and seen as such this sort of, real outlier in terms of, and almost anyone ever talked about transgender women as well. Mm-hmm. And so by comparison to now, it was, it was part of why I think I didn't recognize that I was trans back then, is because it just, didn't have the words or the story for that. But it's still, that the ability to play rugby, to do this sort of non-feminine thing and make it part of my identity, that was really hugely impactful for me. And then the contrast to going to Mozambique, where the gender roles were so rigid, even by comparison to where I grew up. I mean, it was just flopping back and forth from extreme to extreme. Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks for the presentation. It's so great.
Thank you. I could probably take one more question. It's been really great to see everyone here. Oh, yeah.
Andy. I just want to say thank you too. Like I really enjoyed the Bunnyland and AMP that you've been teaching. It'll be great. Just one quick question about that subject. How did all this magic started? Like, how did you connect the bunnies to teaching stats? Or just like fascinated how you could have that idea?
Oh, yeah. So how did I think of the Bunnyland thing? Well, honestly, I was talking to my best friend and saying, you know, God, it's so boring to the students and they're so scared about it. I wish I could think of something that was sort of make it more like a story. And then I was like, you know what? And then I was playing with my kids and they're obsessed with it. They have bunnies and they have Bunnyland. And I was like, why don't I? And then I was like, this could go really bad. Like, you know, I could see everyone cringing from how terrible it was. But I was like, why not? You know, it'll make it more fun for me. You know, the worst thing, it can't be much worse, right? And so, you know, yeah, I live Bunnyland because my kids are so into it. So it was pretty easy to adapt over.
I did the subject last year. So when we transitioned from, you know, face-to-face to the online learning, I thought the exam questions were hilarious. I was laughing the whole time as I was doing it. I was just like all these political careers of all the different characters, you know, how they ended up. It was hilarious. I was laughing while I was doing the exam. It was fantastic.
Cool. Actually, I see one question in the chat, which is maybe a really good question to end on, which is why do I think I've landed on my present optimism? I mean, honestly, to be quite frank, I veer madly back and forth between optimistic and not. So, you know, but I think I'm more optimistic essentially because in some ways I feel like just putting this talk together, I realized, you know, I've been through a lot of hard things and almost all of them have ended up fine and have ended up shaping the person I am. And coronavirus and lockdown and all of this is another hard thing, but hard things aren't necessarily bad things. They can often really make you strong, especially if you kind of reach out that you're, and this is the other thing, I realized my strength is actually a lot of other people and friends and stuff. And so humanity as a whole, we face lots of hard things, but I think we could, you know, if we reach out and hang on and rely on to each other, then I think it can make us stronger and maybe make a better world too, you know, if we're strong and lucky. Like I said, I'm optimistic. Sometimes I'm not, but I'll leave on that optimistic note, I guess. And thank you, everyone. And yeah, we'll make this recording available and probably send out information on the list, how it is. So
thank you.
So thanks, Andy.
Thanks.
Thank you.